Welcome back to episode 8 of The Gray Files, where we peel back the layers of technology, economics, data science, and the human condition itself, all in an effort to decode the vast and often perplexing world we live in. I'm your host, Erika Barker, and in today's episode, we're diving deep into the hit 90s phenomenon called The X-Files, and how it fundamentally changed American politics and culture. It should be noted, if you haven't caught on by now, that The Gray Files is very loosely inspired by The X-Files, not just in the name, but in our shared mission of searching for truth, finding answers between the lines, and digging beneath the surface of news headlines to understand what's really going on. So to kick things off, let's start with a simple observation about human culture. Throughout history, sociologists have noticed something fascinating: the ripple effect. When a single idea gains enough cultural momentum, it doesn't just fade away into background noise. Instead, it triggers chain reactions that can transform how entire societies think, reshaping how millions of people understand reality itself. Our story begins on September 10th of 1993, when such a cultural catalyst appeared on American television screens. It seemed at first glance to be nothing more than a modest science fiction drama about two FBI agents investigating paranormal phenomena. And like those transformative ideas that periodically reshape human consciousness, its effects would ripple outward through American society, fundamentally altering how citizens understood truth, authority, and the very nature of reality itself. This is the story of how a television show about aliens and government conspiracies didn't just entertain audiences. It rewired the cognitive patterns of a nation, creating new ways of thinking about evidence, expertise, and institutional trust that would ultimately reshape American politics, journalism, and the foundations of democratic discourse. It's a tale that begins with the creative vision of one man, but extends to encompass the rise of conspiracy capitalism, the transformation of news media, and the emergence of what we now call alternative facts. To understand how we arrived at our current moment where competing tribes of Americans inhabit entirely different realities, we must first journey back to that autumn evening in 1993 when Special Agents Fox Mulder and Dana Scully first appeared on television screens across America, armed with nothing more than flashlights, federal badges, and a simple tagline that would prove more prophetic than its creators ever imagined. The truth is out there. Part 1: The Architecture of Disbelief. To comprehend the profound impact of the X-Files on American consciousness, we must first understand the cultural landscape in which it took root, a terrain already scarred by revelations so shocking that fiction could barely compete with the documented facts of government deception. Picture, if you will, the America of 1993. This was a nation still reeling from a series of institutional betrayals that had fundamentally altered the relationship between citizens and their government. The Pentagon Papers had revealed that American leaders had systematically misled the public about the Vietnam War for over a decade. Watergate had demonstrated that the highest office in the land was capable of criminal conspiracy. The Iran-Contra affair had exposed a shadow government operating outside constitutional constraints. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the revelations about MKUltra, the CIA's multi-decade program of psychological experimentation on unwitting American citizens. Here was not the stuff of science fiction paranoia, but documented reality. Government scientists administering LSD to mental patients, testing torture techniques on prisoners, and attempting to develop methods of mind control that would have impressed the most creative conspiracy theorist. COINTELPRO had revealed the FBI's systematic surveillance and disruption of civil rights organizations, turning the Bureau into what amounted to a domestic secret police force. And in 1993 itself, the siege at Waco had provided real-time television coverage of government forces assaulting American citizens, culminating in a conflagration that killed dozens of people, including children. This was the landscape of broken trust that the X-Files inherited, a world where the most outlandish conspiracy theories seemed mild compared to what the government had actually done. In such an environment, the show's central premise, that shadowy forces within the government were covering up alien contact and human experiments, didn't seem like science fiction so much as Tuesday morning news. X-Files creator Chris Carter, a former journalist who had transitioned from Disney television development to Fox, understood this cultural moment with remarkable precision. Drawing inspiration from Kolchak, the Night Stalker, and real-life abduction narratives like Whitley Strieber's Communion, Carter crafted a series that existed at the intersection of horror, science fiction, and what he termed existential dread. But the X-Files was never really about aliens or monsters. At its core, it was about America's growing trust problem. The sense that official stories couldn't be believed. The truth was always more complicated than what politicians admitted, and that the most important facts were always hidden from view. The show arrived at a moment when Americans were primed to believe that their government was capable of almost anything. The documented history of institutional deception had created what psychologists call learned helplessness regarding official explanations. If the government had lied about Vietnam, Watergate, Iran-Contra, and MKUltra, what else might they be concealing? Part 2. The Scully Effect and the Power of Representation. While the X-Files would ultimately be remembered for its influence on conspiracy culture and political discourse, its most immediate and measurable impact was in an entirely different domain: the representation of women in science and medicine. Dana Scully, portrayed by Gillian Anderson, represented something unprecedented in popular entertainment. A female scientist who was neither a romantic subplot nor a token character, but the rational, skeptical heart of the series, where her partner Fox Mulder embodied the passionate believer willing to accept any explanation, no matter how outlandish. Scully represented the scientific method personified, demanding evidence, proposing alternative hypotheses, and maintaining intellectual rigor even in the face of phenomena that challenged conventional understanding. The cultural impact was immediate and measurable. By the show's peak in the late 1990s, when it was drawing over 20 million weekly viewers, something remarkable was happening in medical schools and science programs across America. Applications from women surged. In 2018, a comprehensive study by the Gina Davis Institute found that 63% of women in STEM fields surveyed cited Dana Scully as a significant influence on their career choices. This phenomenon, dubbed the Scully Effect by researchers, demonstrated the profound power of representation in popular media. For perhaps the first time in television history, young women could see themselves reflected in a character who was simultaneously brilliant, compassionate, and respected by her male colleagues, not despite her scientific training, but because of it. Scully's impact extended beyond individual career choices to influence broader cultural attitudes about women in science. Her character challenged deeply ingrained stereotypes about both gender roles and scientific expertise, presenting a model of intellectual authority that was neither masculinized or sexualized, but grounded in competence and ethical commitment. The irony, of course, was profound. Even as Scully inspired countless women to pursue careers in science and medicine, the show that made her famous was simultaneously undermining public confidence in the very scientific institutions they would join. Week after week, The X-Files portrayed government scientists as either incompetent or complicit in elaborate cover-ups. Medical examiners overlooked crucial evidence. Academic researchers served hidden agendas. This paradox, the elevation of scientific thinking alongside the systematic questioning of scientific authority, would prove to be one of the X-Files' most complex and consequential legacies. The show created a generation of women who believed in the power of science while distrusting the institutions that practiced it. Part 3: The Smoking Man and the Birth of the Deep State. At the dark heart of the X-Files mythology stood a figure who would prove more influential than any alien or supernatural entity the show had ever created. The cigarette-smoking man, also known simply as Cancer Man, portrayed by William B. Davis. This character embodied everything Americans had learned to fear about unaccountable government power. The Smoking Man was not a traditional villain driven by personal ambition or psychological pathology. He was something far more terrifying to the democratic imagination: a bureaucrat, a middle manager in what the show termed the Syndicate, a shadowy organization that operated within but beyond official government structures, making decisions that affected millions of lives while remaining invisible to democratic oversight. Through this character and the broader mythology surrounding him, The X-Files gave popular culture its most vivid representation of what would later be called the Deep State. This was not the deep state of political science textbooks, the career civil servants and institutional memory that provide continuity across changing administrations. No, this was the deep state of paranoid imagination, a hidden government of unelected officials pursuing secret agendas that subverted democratic will. The Syndicate's collaboration with alien colonizers provided a science fiction framework for exploring very real anxieties about globalization, technological change, and the concentration of power in institutions beyond democratic control. The show's mythology suggested that the most important decisions affecting human civilization were being made not by elected representatives, but by shadowy figures in smoke-filled rooms, literally, in this case, of the cigarette-smoking man. This fictional framework would prove remarkably durable and adaptable. Long after The X-Files ended its initial run, the metaphors it had planted in popular culture would reemerge in political movements across the ideological spectrum. The specific details changed. Instead of aliens, various groups would identify different enemies, but the underlying structure remained constant. hidden powers manipulating surface events for secret purposes. The genius of the X-Files mythology was its flexibility. The show never fully revealed the true nature of the conspiracy it depicted, maintaining what creator Chris Carter called a mythology of ambiguity. This ambiguity allowed viewers to project their own fears and suspicions onto the show's framework, making it a kind of cultural Rorschach test for contemporary anxieties. The Smoking Man became a template for understanding how power really worked in America. He was the face behind the facade, the unelected official making the real decisions while politicians played the roles for public consumption. This framework would later be applied to figures ranging from Karl Rove to Steve Bannon, from Henry Kissinger to Anthony Fauci, any powerful person who seemed to wield influence beyond their official position. Part 4. Fox Network's Education and Audience Psychology. The success of The X-Files provided the Fox Network with an inadvertent masterclass in audience psychology that would prove crucial to the media empire's later evolution. The show's popularity revealed several key insights about American viewers that would reshape not just entertainment programming, but the broader landscape of news and political communication. First, The X-Files demonstrated that audiences had developed a sophisticated appetite for narratives that questioned institutional authority. This wasn't simply anti-government sentiment. It was a more complex form of epistemological skepticism that questioned all official sources of information. Viewers were drawn not just to the show's paranormal events, but to its systematic deconstruction of the reliability of expertise, authority, and conventional wisdom. The show's success revealed that American audiences were hungry for content that validated their growing suspicions about the gap between official explanations and hidden realities. Each episode reinforced the idea that the surface appearances were deceptive, that important truths were being concealed, and that only persistent investigation could reveal what was really happening. Second, the show revealed the commercial viability of fear-based programming. The X-Files succeeded by creating what psychologists call ambient paranoia, a persistent sense that hidden dangers lurked beneath the surface of ordinary life, and that official sources could not be trusted to reveal or address these threats. This emotional framework proved remarkably effective at building audience loyalty and engagement. The psychological mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. By creating a weekly ritual of investigation and revelation, followed by official cover-up and renewed mystery, the show trained viewers to expect deception and to find satisfaction in the process of uncovering hidden truths. This pattern would prove highly adaptable to other forms of media content. Third, The X-Files demonstrated the power of what psychologists call narrative transportation, the process by which audiences become so immersed in a story that they temporarily suspend critical thinking and accept the story's premises as plausible. The show's blend of real government conspiracies with fictional paranormal elements created a narrative environment where viewers learned to question everything while accepting nothing as definitively disproven. These lessons would prove invaluable when Fox launched its news division in 1996, at the height of the X-Files' popularity. Roger Ailes, the network's founding CEO, understood that the same psychological mechanisms that made viewers tune in week after week to watch Mulder and Scully investigate government cover ups could be applied to news programming. Part 5: The Hypnotic Structure of Persuasion. To understand how the X-Files influenced not just individual viewers, but the broader culture of American media and politics, we must examine the sophisticated psychological techniques the show employed. Techniques that would later be adapted and amplified by political movements and media organizations. The X-Files operated through what psychologists recognize as hypnotic structures, patterns of communication that bypass conscious critical thinking and implant ideas directly into the subconscious mind. These techniques included rhythmic delivery patterns, emotional cueing, and the establishment of authority through tone and presentation style. Each episode allowed a carefully calibrated formula designed to maximize psychological impact. The opening credits sequence, with its ominous music and rapid-fire imagery of government documents and paranormal phenomena, established an emotional tone of anxiety and curiosity. The show's signature taglines, "The truth is out there," "Trust no one," and "I want to believe," functioned as mantras that reinforced core themes through repetition. The show's narrative structure created what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, a pattern of occasional revelation followed by renewed mystery that proved highly addictive. Just as slot machines kept gamblers engaged in providing unpredictable rewards, the X-Files kept viewers engaged by occasionally confirming their suspicions while maintaining overall ambiguity about the true nature of the conspiracies being investigated. Perhaps most importantly, the show employed what psychologists call the sleeper effect, a phenomenon where people gradually forget the source of information while retaining the emotional and cognitive impressions it created. Over time, viewers exposed to the X-Files' systematic questioning of official narratives began to internalize these skeptical patterns without necessarily remembering where they had learned them from. This process was accelerated by the show's unique blend of fact and fiction. Real government programs like MKUltra and COINTELPRO were referenced alongside fictional alien conspiracies, creating a cognitive environment where the boundaries between documented reality and speculative fantasy became increasingly blurred. The psychological effects extended far beyond the show's immediate audience. The X-Files helped normalize a particular form of thinking about institutions and authority that would prove remarkably adaptable to different political contexts. The specific targets changed. Instead of shadowy government cabals, different groups would identify different enemies, but the underlying cognitive framework remained constant. Politicians, advertisers, and propagandists quickly recognized the power of these techniques. Rally speeches began incorporating rhythmic delivery patterns and emotional cues that mimicked the show's hypnotic structures. Political slogans adopted the memorable, anxiety-inducing quality of the X-Files taglines, and media organizations discovered that fear-based narratives about hidden enemies could generate the same kind of addictive engagement that had made the show so successful. Part 6: The Rise of Conspiracy Capitalism. In the cultural ecosystem that the X-Files helped create, one entrepreneur would prove particularly adept at monetizing the paranoid imagination the show had cultivated. Alex Jones began his career in public access radio during the mid 1990s, capitalizing on the post Waco anti government sentiment that had reached fever pitch by the time The X Files was becoming a cultural phenomenon. Jones understood something crucial about the audience that The X Files had created. They had been trained to question official narratives and to find hidden patterns in seemingly unconnected events. Where The X Files had presented these themes as entertainment wrapped in deliberate ambiguity, Jones offered something more powerful: the promise that the conspiracies were not only real, but that he could reveal them in detail. The parallels between The X Files and Jones' early programming were striking. Both featured shadowy government cabals manipulating events from behind the scenes. Both suggested that the most important truths were hidden from the public view. Both positioned their audiences as enlightened insiders who could see through official deceptions that fooled the masses. But where The X Files maintained the plausible deniability of fiction, Jones presented his narratives as literal truth. He took the psychological frameworks that the show had established: the suspicion of authority, the pattern seeking behavior, the sense of being privy to hidden knowledge, and applied them to real world events. The September 11th attacks provided Jones with his official breakthrough moment. In an environment where official explanations seemed inadequate to explain the scale of the tragedy, Jones offered an alternative narrative that satisfied the pattern-seeking mindset that the X-Files had cultivated. The claims about false flag operations and inside jobs weren't just conspiracy theories. They were applications of the epistemological framework that millions of Americans had learned from popular entertainment. Jones' genius lay in recognizing that conspiracy thinking could be transformed from a form of entertainment into a business model. Through his InfoWars media empire, he monetized paranoia by selling supplements, survival gear, and other products to audiences who had been conditioned to believe that hidden forces threatened their safety and freedom. The commercial success of this approach demonstrated something profound about the cultural changes that The X-Files had catalyzed. The show hadn't just entertained audiences, it had created new forms of consumer demand, new markets for products and services that promised protection against shadowy threats. This conspiracy capitalism would prove remarkably durable and influential. Long after The X-Files ended its initial run, the business model that Jones pioneered would be adopted by political movements, media organizations, and commercial enterprises across the ideological spectrum. The transformation of conspiracy thinking from a fringe cultural phenomenon into a profitable business model represents one of the most significant changes in American media landscape of the past quarter century. What had once been the domain of small circulation newsletters and late-night radio shows became a multi-billion-dollar industry with sophisticated marketing strategies and professional production values. Part 7. The Cascade Effect and the Collapse of Consensus Reality. As we trace the ripple effects of The X-Files through American culture, we begin to see how a single television show contributed to what historians may someday recognize as one of the most significant transformations in democratic discourse since the invention of the printing press: the collapse of the consensus reality. Prior to the 1990s, Americans might have disagreed about politics, but they generally shared the same basic facts about how the world worked. Republicans and Democrats might interpret events differently, but they typically agreed on what had actually happened. The shared foundation, The common ground that made democratic debate possible began to crumble precisely during the years when The X-Files was at its peak. The show's influence operated through what social scientists call a cascade effect. Just as a small landslide can trigger much larger avalanches by destabilizing the terrain, the X-Files didn't directly cause the epistemic crisis that would later fracture American democracy, but it helped create the conditions that made such a crisis possible. By normalizing radical skepticism about official narratives, the show prepared audiences to accept alternative explanations for major events. By blurring the boundaries between documented conspiracies and fictional ones, it created cognitive frameworks that would accommodate increasingly outlandish claims. By presenting paranoid thinking as a form of enlightened awareness, it made conspiracy theories socially acceptable in ways they had never been accepted before. The political implications became visible during the George W. Bush era, when concepts like the Homeland Security State and a unitary executive drew explicitly on fears about secret government operations. The rhetoric of the deep state that would later become central to Donald Trump's political appeal was already present in the discourse surrounding the expansion of surveillance powers after 9/11. Fox News launched in 1996 at the height of the X-Files' popularity, amplified these trends by applying entertainment industry techniques to news programming. The network's success demonstrated that the same psychological mechanisms that had made viewers question everything in The X-Files could be directed toward specific political targets. The transformation was gradual, but relentless. Each successive political crisis, the 2000 election controversy, the Iraq weapons of mass destruction claims, the 2008 financial collapse, eroded public trust in institutional expertise and official explanations. By the time social media platforms enabled the rapid spread of alternative narratives, the cultural groundwork had already been laid for their acceptance. By the 2016 election, the cultural transformation was complete. Significant portions of the American electorate were operating within entirely different information ecosystems, with competing understandings not just of what policies to pursue, but of what basic facts about reality to accept. The QAnon movement, with its elaborate mythology about hidden cabals and secret operations, represented the logical endpoint of the epistemological framework that the X-Files had helped establish. Part 8. Through Creators' Regret and the Ambiguity Problem. As the cultural influence of The X-Files became apparent in the years following its initial run, creator Chris Carter found himself grappling with an unintended consequence of his creative vision. The show that he had conceived as entertainment had evolved into something more powerful and potentially dangerous, a template for understanding reality itself. Carter has publicly expressed concerns about the show's lasting influence on American trust and conspiracy culture. In interviews, he has acknowledged that he never intended for viewers to take the show's paranoid worldview as literal doctrine. The ambiguity that had been central to the show's design, the deliberate refusal to provide definitive answers about the nature of the conspiracies it depicted, had been meant to preserve the mystery that made the show compelling. But Carter discovered that the contemporary audiences might not process ambiguity the same way that previous generations had. Where earlier viewers might have understood the show's uncertainties as artistic choices designed to maintain suspense, Later audiences increasingly interpreted ambiguity as evidence of deliberate concealment. If the truth about alien conspiracies remained hidden, many viewers concluded it must be because powerful forces were actively suppressing it. This ambiguity problem reflects a broader challenge in contemporary media and politics. In an information environment characterized by overwhelming complexity and constant change, ambiguity can become a source of anxiety rather than intrigue. When people cannot determine what is true, they often gravitate toward explanations that promise certainty, even if those explanations are demonstrably false. The X-Files had inadvertently trained its audience to expect hidden truths behind official explanations, to find patterns in seemingly random events, and to trust their intuitive suspicions over expert analyses. These cognitive habits, which served the show's dramatic purposes, proved less adaptive when applied to real-world political and social challenges. The show's influence on conspiracy culture created what Carter himself came to recognize as a cultural problem. By making paranoid thinking entertaining and socially acceptable, the X-Files had helped create the conditions for what would later emerge as alternative facts, deep state theories, and the epistemic tribalism that characterizes contemporary American politics. Carter's regret reflects a broader recognition among media creators about the unintended consequences of their work, the techniques that make fiction compelling: emotional manipulation, pattern seeking, the suggestion of hidden truths, can become dangerous when audiences apply them to real-world situations that require careful analyses and evidence-based reasoning. The responsibility of content creators in democratic societies extends beyond entertainment value to encompass the broader cultural and political effects of their work. Now, this is not to advocate for censorship or heavy-handed content restrictions, but rather for a more thoughtful consideration of how popular culture shapes public understanding of reality. Part 9. The Mirror of Star Trek. To fully understand the cultural significance of The X-Files, we must consider it alongside another science fiction franchise that exerted profound influence on American culture, but in precisely the opposite direction. Where The X-Files cultivated suspicion and paranoia, Star Trek promoted optimism and scientific rationalism. Where The X-Files suggested that hidden forces manipulated events for sinister purposes, Star Trek envisioned a future where transparent institutions work toward common goals. The contrast is illuminating and instructive. Star Trek, which debuted in 1966 and continued through multiple iterations, inspired countless individuals to pursue careers in science, technology, and space exploration. NASA officially regularly cites the show's influence on public support for space programs. Engineers and scientists frequently credit Star Trek with shaping their career choices and professional values. The show's vision of the future, a post-scarcity society organized around scientific exploration and diplomatic cooperation, provided a positive template for thinking about technological and social progress. Even when Star Trek episodes dealt with conflict and moral ambiguity, they typically concluded with rational problem-solving and ethical reflection. The X-Files, by contrast, rarely offered positive resolutions to the dilemmas it explored. Government officials were almost invariably corrupt or compromised. Scientific institutions were either ineffective or actively complicit in cover-ups. Truth, when it emerged at all, usually revealed horrors that justified the paranoid suspicions that drove the investigation. This fundamental difference in worldview had profound implications for how audiences approached real world challenges. Star Trek viewers learned to see science and democratic institutions as tools for problem solving. The X Files viewers learned to see those same institutions as likely sources of the problems themselves. The cultural impact extended beyond individual attitude formation to influence broader social and political trends. The Star Trek vision contributed to what historians call technological optimism, the belief that scientific and engineering advances could improve human welfare and solve social problems. The X Files vision contributed to what might be called institutional pessimism, the assumption that official explanations were likely false and that hidden agendas drove surface events. Both shows reflected and shaped the cultural moments in which they emerged. Star Trek embodied the confident rationalism of the Great Society era, when Americans believed that scientific expertise and federal programs could address major social challenges. The X Files captured the institutional distrust of the post Watergate era, when Americans had learned that government officials routinely lied about matters of life and death. The comparison reveals something important about the relationship between popular culture and social values. Entertainment doesn't just reflect existing attitudes, it shapes them, providing cognitive frameworks and emotional associations that influence how people interpret new information and make decisions about whom to trust and what to believe. Part 10. The question of democratic epistemology. As we reach the contemporary moment in our explanation of the X-Files' cultural influence, we must confront a fundamental question about the relationship between popular entertainment and democratic governance. Can a society maintain the healthy skepticism that democracy requires without falling into the nihilistic paranoia that makes democratic discourse impossible? This question goes to the heart of what philosophers call democratic epistemology, the shared methods for determining truth that allow citizens to engage in meaningful political debate. Democracy requires citizens who can think critically about official claims and hold their leaders accountable. But it also requires a basic level of trust in institutions and expertise that make collective action possible. The X-Files helped erode this delicate balance by promoting a form of skepticism that was essentially nihilistic. The show suggested that truth was always hidden, that official explanations were invariably false, and that only paranoid suspicion could reveal reality. This framework made viewers more resistant to propaganda and official manipulation, but it also made them resistant to evidence and expert analyses when those sources contradicted their pre-existing beliefs. The cultural transformation that the X-Files helped catalyze reflects a broader challenge facing democratic societies in the information age. Traditional gatekeeping institutions, newspapers, universities, scientific organizations have lost much of their authority to determine what counts as reliable information. In their place, we have a fragmented media landscape where different communities operate within entirely different information ecosystems. This fragmentation has created what researchers call tribal thinking, the tendency for different groups to develop completely different understandings of basic facts. Republicans and Democrats don't just disagree about policy anymore. They disagree about whether climate change is real, whether vaccines are safe, and whether elections can be trusted. The X-Files did not create this epistemic crisis. but it provided a cultural template that made such fragmentation possible. By normalizing the idea that official sources couldn't be trusted and that hidden forces manipulated surface events, the show prepared audiences to reject any information that didn't conform to their preferred narratives. The challenge for contemporary democracy is to develop new forms of institutional trust and epistemic authority that can function in a post-trust environment. This requires both technical solutions and better systems for verifying information and detecting manipulation, and cultural changes that restore some measure of shared commitment to evidence-based reasoning. Democratic societies need citizens who are neither gullible nor paranoid, who can distinguish between healthy skepticism and destructive cynicism, who can recognize genuine expertise without surrendering their capacity for independent thought. This is a difficult balance to maintain under the best of circumstances, and the current information environment makes it even more challenging. Part 11. The Path Forward. As we conclude our journey through the cultural transformation that the X-Files helped catalyze, we must ask ourselves, what lessons can we draw from this remarkable example of entertainment's power to reshape society? And how might we apply those lessons to navigate the epistemic challenges that face democratic societies in the digital age? The story of The X-Files teaches us that popular culture is never merely entertainment. The stories we tell ourselves through television, film, books, and digital media shape how we understand reality itself. They provide the cognitive frameworks through which we interpret events, evaluate evidence, and make decisions about whom to trust and what to believe. This power comes with profound responsibility. Content creators, media executives, and technology platforms must grapple with the unintended consequences of their creative choices. The techniques that make stories compelling, emotional manipulation, pattern seeking, the suggestion of hidden truths, can become dangerous when audiences apply them to real-world situations that require careful analyses and evidence-based reasoning. But the lesson of the X-Files is not that we should abandon skepticism or return to uncritical trust and authority. The government conspiracies that provided the historical foundation for the show's mythology were real. The institutional failures that created space for paranoid interpretations were genuine. A healthy democracy requires citizens who can question official narratives and hold their leaders accountable. The challenge is to develop what we might call smart skepticism, the ability to question authority without rejecting evidence, to spot real conspiracies without seeing patterns where none exist, to trust democratic institutions while acknowledging they're far from perfect. This requires both individual and institutional changes. Citizens must develop stronger critical thinking skills and better understanding of how information can be manipulated. Educational institutions must teach not just facts, but methods for evaluating evidence and detecting bias. Media organizations must take responsibility for the psychological effects of their content and not just its entertainment value. Perhaps, most importantly, we must learn to live with ambiguity without letting it drive us toward paranoid certainty. The real world is complex, uncertain, and often genuinely mysterious. Not every question has a clear answer. Not every pattern reflects a hidden design. Sometimes the truth really is out there, but sometimes it's simply unknowable with the information available. Fox Mulder famously declared, "I want to believe." But perhaps the most appropriate slogan for our current moment would be, "I want to verify." This reflects a commitment to evidence based reasoning that maintains healthy skepticism without abandoning the possibility of knowledge itself. The path forward requires rebuilding social trust without sacrificing intellectual independence, restoring faith in institutions without surrendering critical thinking, and creating new forms of democratic discourse that can function in an age of information abundance and epistemological uncertainty. In the end, the story of the X-Files and its cultural influence reflects something fundamental about human psychology and social organization. We are pattern-seeking creatures living in a complex world that often resist simple explanations. We crave certainty in an uncertain universe, and we're drawn to stories that promise to reveal hidden truths and secret knowledge. These psychological tendencies are neither good nor bad in themselves. They're simply part of what makes us human. The challenge is to channel them in ways that serve rather than undermine our collective well-being. We need stories that help us navigate complexity without overwhelming us with paranoia. We need institutions that earn trust without demanding blind faith. We need media that informs without manipulating. The cultural transformation that the X-Files helped catalyze reminds us that we are always in the process of creating the reality we inhabit. The stories we tell, the media we consume, and the frameworks we use to interpret events all contribute to the shared understanding of the world that makes democratic life possible. As we face the challenges of the digital age, artificial intelligence, climate change, global inequality, the ongoing evolution of democratic institutions, we would do well to remember the lessons that the X-Files inadvertently taught us about the power of narrative to shape reality. The truth, as Mulder and Scully might say, is indeed out there. But finding it requires not just paranoid suspicion or blind trust, but careful, patient work of evidence gathering, hypotheses testing, and collaborative reasoning that has always been the foundation of both good science and good democracy. In the vast landscape of human possibility, we are always choosing which future to create. The stories we tell today will shape the reality our children inherit tomorrow. That's a responsibility worthy of the most careful consideration, and perhaps the most important truth that any science fiction show could help us understand. The files remain open. The search continues, and the truth, as always, is out there awaiting our discovery.